make sure we have time for Jacob. Our next presenter is Jacob Marques Rollison. And Jake is an independent scholar living and working at L'Abri Fellowship in Weymouth, Switzerland. Among his publications, he's the author of a new reading of Jacques Ellul, Presence and Communication in the Postmodern World. He's the editor of Jacques Ellul and the Bible, Towards a Hermeneutic of Freedom, and he's the translator of Ellul's 2-volume To Will and To Do, an Introduction to Christian Ethics. He also serves on the IJES Board of Directors, and he's my new co-president of IJES. And I'm thrilled to introduce him to you.
There we go. I just want to highlight once again how wonderful it is that Ted Lewis is in the room with us, and not just Ted, but his whole family. Good afternoon. It's an honor and a pleasure to have been with you all these last days to talk about this book, The Technological Society. Let me recall that Aldous Huxley, the author of the globally influential dystopian novel Brave New World, said that Ellul's book, quote, really made the case he tried to make and suggested it would become, and I think this is in the words of the translator, but describing Huxley's thought, he said, one of the 20th century's most authentic documents of social criticism. Ever since Ellul's work first gripped me 15 years ago, just several miles from here at Wheaton College, I've been in continual and ever-deepening dialogue with Ellul's thought. My presentation today has a modest goal. First, to comment on what Ellul was doing, both in all his work and in the book which concerns us. And then second, in light of these comments, to offer suggestions for how to read him. In particular, I will try to portray Ellul's ethical thought in broad strokes, but to do so accurately. In that respect, I'm not trying to do anything particularly original or revolutionary here. The most original thing I will probably do is read some passages from Ellul's untranslated writings. If you leave with a balanced understanding of how Ellul's work communicates, I will consider my goal achieved, or maybe a more balanced understanding. With that in mind, I have 3 preliminary comments before I really jump in. First, I would emphasize that Ellul's work is a communicative address. Everything in his writings, the history, the sociology, the ethics, the theology, etc., all these genres are situated within an address to the reader. Their ultimate value, therefore, does not come from how many big universities or famous people take them seriously, but from their status as words spoken by one human to another. That means that they have a universal communicative intent. Anyone can read them and feel addressed by them. Anyone can respond to them by taking them seriously and questioning themselves. We might say that Ellul's project is therefore ultimately rhetorical if we take rhetoric not as a technique for winning arguments, but in the sense of a spoken human word, with all the most incarnate and even spiritual dimensions that speech involves. But this universal communication is double-edged. If on the one hand it addresses anybody with ears to hear, on the other it calls them to do a lot of intellectual labor. His work challenges academics because they are not used to being addressed, and it challenges the average layperson today because they are not used to such heavy intellectual lifting. Approaching Ellul carefully means highlighting the challenge posed to both sides. It should take care that the academic actually hears Ellul's work as an address, but also spur the layperson to do the work necessary to get what Ellul is saying, because it isn't self-evident. My second comment to start is that I think Ellul's work is kind of like a puzzle. To really understand a piece of the puzzle, you need a picture of the box. You need to see how it fits synthetically into the whole picture. But in the case of Ellul's work, acquiring a decent image of that big picture on the box requires an obscene amount of reading and time. Things conspicuously absent from one book might receive a chapter or even a book-length treatment elsewhere. The only corrective, unfortunately, is to keep going, to take the dialogue further. Or fortunately, rather. In the reception of this, perhaps the most influential of Ellul's sociological works, both of these aspects, the communicative and the synthetic, are in play in both positive and negative ways. When the Technological Society landed in the United States in the mid-60s, it was surprisingly difficult to treat it as a piece of social analysis because the communicative aspect hit its readers like a rhetorical ton of bricks. Two careful readers from the American South, James Holloway and Will Campbell, wrote, quote, "Ellul speaks to our guts and to our heads." And if Ellul's address ultimately aimed to liberate his readers by making them aware, an unbalanced reading sometimes led to the opposite outcome. Some readers felt paralyzed. So John Wilkinson, the translator who was working in Berkeley, California at the time, who translated it into English, said, quote, "Ellul's book had acted more like an infectious disease than as a serious social critique. The participants simply couldn't get beyond it, something like the hypnotic power of the fabled basilisk." Or worse than paralysis, without the fine-tuning gained through reading Ellul's work synthetically, this hypnotic power sometimes led its readers to ethically deplorable outcomes or actions. Witness the case of its most infamous reader, the Harvard-educated mathematical prodigy who was completely convinced by the Technological Society's arguments, yet who then embarked on the mail bomb campaign which made him the US's biggest case of domestic terrorism before 9/11. I'm of course referring to Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. While his narrow reading of Ellul was not the only force at work, sampling almost any of Ellul's theology books would have counterweighted the rhetorical force of the Technological Society, challenging in advance any justification he may have had for his violent actions. Third, to retake the title of the 2012 Chicago Area Conference of the IJES, I suggest that hearing Ellul as a, quote, prophet in the technological wilderness is still the most robust way to take him seriously. Now, the word prophet simply does not fit into most of our categories, but it purposely pushes back on them and reframes them. Ellul sought not merely to analyze, but to exhort, not only to expound, but to interrogate, and not simply to write history, but to encourage a different future. The label of prophet rigorously captures these exhortative, communicative, and temporal dimensions, but it also provocatively indicates the source of the hope driving Ellul's theology, which is the self-giving and liberating presence of the God of love who revealed himself in Jesus Christ. Finally, reading Ellul as a prophet invites the reader into continual dialogue, not only with Ellul, but also with this God, and this is a dialogue which transcends all technique. That's it for my preliminary comments. They're a bit long, sorry. Now on to my main topic. Following David Gill's suggestion, it seemed good to round out this conference by placing the argument of the Technological Society in dialectical tension with that which it sought to inspire, namely an ethics of freedom. So this is part 2 of my talk, Ellul's original plan for the Technological Society. The Technological Society was not intended to be published as we now know it. In an exchange of letters at the end of his life, Ellul gives a rare glimpse of his original intention. I will read a very long citation in which Ellul boils down his whole project to one question. This one question involved 2 poles in tension, which becomes the foundation for the architecture of his sociological and theological investigations. He writes, quote, "I certainly conceived of my books as a whole. Fundamentally, my big question was, does knowledge of historical and sociological facts put in question the faith of the revelation that I received? And reciprocally, how can this faith made present respond to certain problems of modern man and society? In other words, I decided to undertake a critique of the world in which I lived, on the basis of the truth in which I believed. But, reciprocally, Did this deepened knowledge of society, of Western modern man, of modern thought, allow for a critique of this truth? Does this truth hold fast in the face of science, technique, and philosophy, and also amidst the events of our time? This was my question, and the reason I researched and wrote. I wrote less for others than to clarify both the gravity of this revelation and the meaning which appeared to me in this world where I lived. What elucidates this project rather well was the first of my books, which was never published as I had written it. I'm referring to the Technological Society. The work which I produced was twice as long as what was ultimately published, more than 1,000 pages, and unpublishable since the author was a nobody. My book was conceived thus: one chapter of sociological analysis of technique, and a chapter of theology or ethics, we might say of systematic theology, which was intended to form a counterpart. And between this pair and the following pair, another chapter of sociological analysis and one of systematic theology, a literary interlude. No publisher was interested, and finally the publisher Colin accepted the sociological chapters. The others were bundled together and constituted the 3 volumes of The Ethics of Freedom. End quote. Examining this original intention reveals a few things. I know he wasn't here, and most of us probably didn't watch the video, but in Frédéric Rognon's talk, we can see just how faithful Ellul was to Søren Kierkegaard in the architecture of his work. For both authors, Kierkegaard and Ellul, you really must read everything in order to understand almost any of it properly. And if we only read one part, we misunderstand it because we only get one moment of a larger movement. Second, we understand just how seriously Ellul meant it when he said he conceived of his 60-some books as one giant project, to be understood together. But third, and most importantly for me today, we see that the Technological Society is only understood correctly when we place it in tension with the ethics of freedom. Again, Rognon's paper sketches this out well by showing how, for Ellul, technique manifests an order of necessity to which humanity belongs today. Technique names the way that things are heading unless we do something to change it. The Technological Society paints the picture of just how demanding such change would be. The ethics of freedom, on the other hand, is an invitation to Christians and non-Christians alike to discover freedom beyond all technique through hope, proposing hope in Jesus Christ as a superlatively liberating force. So now that we see that we have to hold the Technological Society and the ethics of freedom in tension with one another, I will develop the contrast that Ellul lays out between technical morality, or morality conforming to technique, and an ethics of freedom. So the next section is morality versus ethics. We should pay attention to that difference in terminology. Technical morality versus an ethics of freedom. Why not use the same term twice, like technical morality versus morality of freedom, or technical ethics versus ethics of freedom? In Ellul's usage, which may be idiosyncratic, morality and ethics mean 2 different things, and at times he even opposes them strongly to one another. He discusses their difference in 2 main places. First, in the Introduction to Christian Ethics, To Will and to Do, and second, in the manuscript of his Ethics of Holiness. Now, that second text will be published in French for the first time this fall, so forget about it in English, at least for the time being. Its publication should remind us that a full understanding of Ellul's project is still to come. It is therefore a very exciting time to be doing Ellul research if you're thinking of doing a PhD on him. Start learning French now, in other words. So to draw out the contrast between morality and ethics, I will note 3 things about morality from To Will and to Do before I examine a long citation from the Ethics of Holiness, which is still to come. So in To Will and to Do, Ellul notes how morality is a group phenomenon. For whatever else it involves or might be, moral behavior demonstrates a relation to a given group. Obeying or disobeying a group's morality, respectively, demonstrates either independence or belonging in relation to the group. Second, morality expresses this group's approach to questions of good and evil. In Ellul's sociology, the good is not an absolute principle transcending societies and cultures. Instead, Ellul focuses on the apprehension of good and evil by a given group at a given time. And third, whether consciously or unconsciously, a group's morality serves and acts as a justification for being the way that they are. Ellul is particularly critical of how morality plays this justifying role, keeping people from putting themselves in question. His theology in this volume uses the Protestant doctrine of justification in Christ alone to ruthlessly stifle this moral function of justification. This does not mean that morality is always constraining or restrictive or wrong or anything like that. But for Ellul, it does mean that ethics is something wider and broader. Ethics takes morality into account, but it cannot be reduced to it. In a passage from the Ethics of Holiness, Ellul summarizes the things I've just described before he draws a sharp contrast with ethics. So here's another long citation, maybe even longer than my previous long one. So here you go. Certainly, we must differentiate, and I would even say oppose, ethics and morality, which are not at all the same thing. Morality is an ensemble of precepts or rules, formulated more or less clearly, often with a purely pragmatic origin. It is a practice which we assimilate to the good by way of the group's justification of itself. Morality lays down the you must and the you must not, according to the social body. It is justifying and edifying in the banal sense and not the evangelical sense, which is to say that it leads to certificates of good conduct and it makes a model of the virtuous man. Morality situates good and evil, vice and virtue, at the level of normal opinion, but it is formulated into a body of clearly conceived rules and imperatives. Ethics is exactly the opposite. It is not a knowledge of the rules of good and evil, since precisely the autonomous determination of good and evil is sin itself. If we examine all the ethical orientations from the Old Testament, the Gospels, and the Epistles, we see a proclamation coming from God of a being of man. It is the orientation of a way to be pursued, but this is a path which is neither ready-made nor clearly marked or signposted, which would still be a kind of morality, but a path which is made bit by bit, carved out as we walk, in accordance with our desire to live, here to live according to the will of God, and again here according to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Ethics is thus the contrary of ready-made rules. It is a lived freedom which is not constructed ahead of time. It is not a category of human nature, but a continuously renewed creation. It is a call, a proclamation, a signpost, the search for a conviction. It puts our back against the wall. It is exhortation, but also a surgical operation destroying morality and having, Pharisaism and laxism, systematic and structured, which would cover the... Oh, sorry, I skipped a line. Pharisaism and laxism, self-satisfaction and suicidal nihilism. It is the opposite of a well-made philosophical fabrication, systematic and structured, which would cover the whole range of moral questions. Thus, ethics obliges us to point the finger at ourselves, while morality is the means for hiding, masking ourselves, disappearing behind rules and precepts. Certainly, ethics implies a way of speaking. It must be spoken, but not as a system and in precepts, but rather as an interrogation." End quote. So in describing a technical morality, Ellul is applying his theses regarding technique to questions of human relation to right and wrong, to living and acting. In behavior defined by technique, the freedom and unpredictability of ethics is already far too inefficient to be enframed in a technical system. Ethics must be reduced to morality so that technique can progress unhindered. The justification permitted by morality in general becomes more rigorous once morality becomes technical. This morality restricts the operation of human language, cutting off any deep self-questioning, whether individual or social. Morality's justifying function becomes primary, since the logic of technique implies reducing anything which would impede its function. Against this, Ellul's ethical interrogation seeks to rehabilitate the humiliated human word, to unleash its ability to question everything, including ourselves and the direction of our entire society. He calls us to be present, that is, to open our ears and our eyes, to listen and look in our bodies, and with that other part of our humanity, which is irreducible to material, whatever name we might give it, whether mind or spirit or soul, in the time and place where we live. So having now seen what is at stake in these two terms, let's turn more specifically to technical morality and the ethics of freedom. So final section, technical morality versus the ethics of freedom. It would be foolish to try to summarize everything that Ellul has to say about these topics in my remaining time. I'll just offer a few lines of what seems the most pertinent today. A chapter in To Will and To Do examines technical morality, and I think it's worth reading. It looks at the morality of the technological society. It's written 60 years ago, but I think it's still pretty accurate. Here is what I consider the briefest summary of that chapter. Quote, "The morality that currently exists in our society is composed of two rather different elements. One part is a leftover from the Christian morality produced in the Middle Ages, which was transformed in the 16th and 17th centuries, emphasizing individual virtues and oriented towards charity. The other part is a technical morality, emphasizing collective virtues and oriented toward work. We are witnessing the formation of a new morality, purely technical, in which the elements of the Christian morality contained in bourgeois morality are progressively being eliminated. This technical morality is not yet complete. Its constitution is currently in progress, but it is assuredly the morality of tomorrow." End quote. So Ellul gives several characteristics of this technical morality. First, normal replaces moral. Children grow up wanting to be normal, not to be good. Conformity to a standard model becomes both morally desirable and a requirement. Likewise, we are critical not so much of immoral behavior, but of deviant behavior, which departs from an accepted norm. Second, this new morality values success. A thing is good because it works or because it succeeds. Success becomes proof of goodness. And third, technical morality is concerned with behavior. Things like motives or personal interpretation are non-essential. What matters is behavior that conforms. Or sometimes behavior is left to individual decision, but only where it has become insignificant. We can do whatever we want only where no one is worried that it will change anything important. This is a morality of conformity, of function, of efficiency, and of productivity. In contrast, Ellul sketches an ethics of freedom in the book bearing that title. The full French text is nearly 1,200 pages, and that's only part of his Christian ethics. Now, whatever you might think about Christianity or the church or Jesus, if you're tempted to check out here and say, well, I'm only here for the technology stuff, this part doesn't apply to me, well, I think that would be a shame. Ellul wrote that the whole value of his ethics would come from a confrontation. So I invite you to do him the honor of letting that confrontation happen and give it its full weight. Ellul's overarching project of Christian ethics might be described succinctly as follows. First, Ellul thinks that God's action liberates. It breaks up hardened social unities, undoes sociological determinations, and it creates a free people. So it is very first an ethics of freedom. Second, it separates this free people, making them into something new and different from what they were before. This break and this newness are communicated by the word holiness. It is therefore an ethics of holiness in the second place. And finally, the separation of holiness is not one of being better than anyone else in any way at all. It is separation for a specific act of service, for the creation of a new relationship, a new social unity defined by love. It is thirdly, therefore, an ethics of love, or relationship. Freedom, then separation and recreation, that is holiness, and finally, a new relationship of love. With respect to morality, it becomes a reference point for Christian ethics. It is taken into account as a matter of communication. At different times, therefore, the Christian ethics of freedom will both obey and disobey, respect and transgress this technical morality. In the technological society, Ellul described the breakdown of local, traditional social unities as a precondition to the rise of technique. His sociology and his theology thus offer contrasting narratives of social transformation. Both technique and the Word of God seemingly break up social unities and transform them, but the orientation, the means, and the kind of change differ greatly. So Ellul intends ethics of freedom as a liberating word responding to the necessity discernible in the development of a society driven by technique. I suggest reading the Ethics of Freedom as a sort of contemporary Protestant spiritual exercise. The whole thing is constructed on a division taken from Martin Luther between freedom from and freedom for. It reads as if Ellul walks with the reader, starting in alienation and slavery, moving towards freedom, learning what we are freed from, and then exploring what we are freed for. As my time is now very short, 2 final comments. First, for listeners who are new to Ellul's theology, in Ellul's reading, the God that we meet in Jesus Christ is nonviolent and is opposed to all forms of domination. Instead, Ellul's God freely gives himself, preferring to be killed rather than to kill. This God's creation-wide political rule is expressed by this refusal to dominate those under his power. Instead, God's politics is a creative, caring presence given graciously and freely to all. Ellul's God is both radically free, frighteningly beyond our grasp, and intimately present in human and creaturely affairs. Unlike the logic of technique, Ellul's God is less concerned with control and consequences than with freeing humans to be his dialogue partners. To be a valued dialogue partner is precisely not to be the object of a technical operation. And second, I read Ellul's theology as an extended meditation on incarnation, both in general in the sense of our life as both material and spiritual, and in Christianity, that is, in God's taking on human flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, living among humanity, instituting a new way of relating to one another. God's incarnation bestows a profound dignity on the meaning of the simple fact of being a human creature. All of technique's promises to increase our control, to alter the proportions of our relationships with one another or with our time and space, to augment our power, all these are so many temptations to exchange that dignity and meaning for something which is ultimately destructive of this kind of incarnate freedom. Ellul proposes a pedagogy, a learning to be human, limited, relative, humble creatures living in the presence of God. The second untranslated tome of the Ethics of Freedom, holds one of my favorite sections in all of Ellul's writing, which describes what he calls the 3 categories of freedom for Christian ethics. These 3 categories are the useless, the provisory, and the relative. They oppose the use value that characterizes our society's way of measuring, the eternal, which describes certain philosophical approaches to truth, and the absolute, in the presence of which Ellul writes, no freedom is possible. If Ellul wasn't exactly postmodern, he is trying to untangle the Christian life from Enlightenment and technical ways of thinking and being. In closing, then, all of this is evoked in Ellul's reading of Jesus' 3 temptations in the wilderness, which he shares with his friend Charbonneau, and which is filtered through Fyodor Dostoevsky. For Ellul, Jesus refuses to incarnate anything other than a humble dialogue with God the Father. By refusing any other ways of being who he is, Jesus' relation to God encapsulates the most robust definition of freedom which Ellul gives. Quote, only the unmediated relation with God is total freedom. By refusing power and domination, Jesus throws down the gauntlet of true human freedom, and according to Ellul and Charbonneau, the West does not take it up, and succumbs instead to the seduction of power. If we have ears to hear Ellul's prophetic address, that gauntlet is again thrown down to us today. So may we let his ethical interrogation do its work, inquiring as to what's really going on at the heart of our collective life together. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Awesome. So we have time for questions. And David, do you want to start out here?
Yes, I really love that, Jake. I've been working on Ellul's ethics all my life, and I'm happy to hand the talk to you, and I think you'll take it a lot farther than I ever did. One thing I love about Too Willing to Do is the way Ellul contrasts lived moralities with theoretical moralities. And so he was wonderful at saying it's not just what people say is their ethics or morality, it's what they actually live by. What are their values expressed in their life? And that's where that technological morality thing is so profound and insightful. The only other thing I want to say is that sometimes you can feel like Ellul is leaving us cut loose in a completely individualistic, situational, you might say, with no guidance whatsoever. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's much more like Kierkegaard, his favorite philosopher, who had that aesthetic stage where you're living for your own tastes and inclinations. And then the second stage on life's way is the moral, the ethical stage that Kierkegaard talks about, where you are living by rules of decorum and justice as interpreted in the social group. But there's a religious stage above that where you're living not just in relationship to commands, but in relationship to a commander, in that existential relationship to the holy other, you might say. And I think that in Kierkegaard and in Ellul, it isn't like you escape the preceding stages, but you relativize them in a sense. So we never get locked into a life where we're following wooden commands without reaching for the life of freedom, which can be really crazy, which he illustrates with Fear and Trembling, where Abraham is asked by the commander to actually violate one of those commands against murder. I think of it also like David Lufkin about jazz. You know, that great jazz, there is a kind of structure underneath. There's a standard. It's not just everybody doing whatever they want. There's a kind of structure to it, but it comes alive when people improvise and are following, you might say, the collective spirit of the band or something like that. So anyway, that's all I have to say, but I love what your proposal is.
Thanks very much, David. And on the improvisation thing, I just want to say, so in other words, Ellul's not saying don't care about morals, don't care about good and evil, don't care about your society's rules. He's saying, like a good jazz musician, learn well enough to break them in a good way. Learn them so that your life is not just following sheet music, but actually kind of doing something with it, something free.
I was asked one time what jazz is, and it seems to me it's fairly simple. It's a conversation. And whether this is free jazz and bebop, it doesn't matter. One person listening to the other and the group listening to us. And you play stuff that you never thought. You in fact, are in a very strange sense of time. And when I first read Bergson, the idea of internal time consciousness, it seemed to me that the notion of la durée was exactly what happens in the jazz musician's sense of time. And then thinking then about Bergson, and I don't recall Ellul referring to Bergson's the book on two sources of morality and religion, but the distinction between ethics and morality seemed to be very close. Do you feel that?
So I don't know Bergson very well, but in Too Willing to Do, Ellul is arguing with it. I know it pops up quite a bit in the footnotes. I think he's not as critical of Bergson as he is of some others, but there's a mix of critical dialogue and appreciation. But in terms of what you said about dialogue as the kind of core or essence of jazz, again, the notes, the music, the structure, all of that has its meaning because it's within a dialogue. It's not outside the dialogue. And to me, that goes back to Ellul's theology. This morning, I forget who it was, I think Daniel Sahazred mentioned he proposed the biblical idea of a covenant with nature, saying that a covenant is this agreement that takes into consideration. And he told us that in French, the word is alliance. The word alliance in French also means marriage, and we also speak of marriage covenant in its most profound sense. So for Ellul, that's what happens at Sinai is God marries the Jewish people. And Christianity carries that same metaphor forward. And so in other words, the command to not commit adultery, for example, only has meaning because there's this love relationship that it's within. And that is a radically different approach to Christian ethics than what we often grow up with. Instead we're like, oh, I have to obey this command, otherwise it's not love or something. But it's more like, if you do love, then the command is almost like, it's seen as a self-evident kind of, well, of course. Anyway, that's a side note.
You're probably the perfect person to ask. One of the things I think about a lot is like Ellul's intense like personalism and the sort of anarchism and the emergent character of like figuring things out in a moment. And I always struggle with the question of like tradition or education. You know, the ways in which we receive from the past or transmit into the future, and providing an account for that does not collapse into just, that's just another kind of technique in the bad sense of things. And I was wondering if maybe, you could help speak to that, because I'm curious.
Sure. I mean, so again, reading a little what he's doing, there are times where he says, we heard in Daryl Charles' paper yesterday about, he's like, look, we're not going to consult Augustine or Luther or whatever to tell us what to do today. But he says that having widely and longly consulted Karl Barth and Kierkegaard. So obviously he's not opposed to that, and Kierkegaard himself was just doing nothing but consulting Hamann and Luther before him. So it is a dialogue. So in other words, only in this dialogue do you learn that, wow, now that you've read everything Kierkegaard said, he's still not going to answer the question, what do you do? There's this sense of you're alive and you're free. And so there's a line in Ethics of Freedom where Ellul says, if we give orders, we deny freedom. He says, all I can really do, and this is what he's trying to do, is put the problems as clearly as I can, and then say, now it's up to you to go figure it out, not by doing anything except by living out your faith in this situation. And so you can see that the outcome, like Ellul's work is finished when you go, well, what do I do? And he says, great, I'm done. Like you've understood, you're frustrated, and now you're ready to ask. And that's where he's happy. He's done his negative work, if you will.
Jacob, thank you so much for that. This is a question in reading, willing to do, and others regarding holiness. So you can beg off and you can wait for the translation. But when he sets up the criteria, you mentioned separation of people, in that category of the holiness and the ethics of freedom. We're also aware of his project to demythologize and desacralize technique, for example. And holiness has its connotations of, are we setting up a new sacred or something like that? So the relationship of holiness to the project of desacralization and demythologization, since sacredness is usually attached to holiness. I just wondered if you had any impressions on that.
Sure. What I think, there's a paper from Daryl Fashing before he passed away that he started, I think, not sure he actually finished it, called The Sacred, the Secular, and the Holy. And so there is at least one old attempt at this, or older. And I kind of argue with him a bit, but we'll both be wrong once we read the 950 pages of Ellul's Ethics of Holiness. But all that to say, so no, yes, he is vehemently about desacralizing, breaking the old approach to the sacred, like Geri was emphasizing for us this morning. But does holiness mean a new sacred? I think no. Only because, or if it does, you could say yes, but it's a sacred to the God who desacralizes what sacred itself means. So in other words, one example is he talks about in the Old Testament, when the Jews would build altars, they could only use unsculpted stones. If you used a tool on the rock, it was not usable in an altar. And the exception, of course, is the temple, but the reason that's an exception is very important, and that's another long conversation. But so all that to say, the fact that for him holiness means you refuse to do it your way, to exert your control over the material. It means that you abandon that approach. So you abandon all attempts to control, all technique, if you will, in this pejorative sense. And you, for Ellul, I guess it is a process that keeps freedom a continual and ongoing concern. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
I think I've got the mic.
I think it is.
Great talk. Thanks so much, Jacob. You quoted Ellul that complete freedom is found in relationship with God. I'm curious what he makes of the Old Testament regulations then, like if ethics is kind of transcending of morality. I mean, so much of the Old Testament seems to be morality, and that kind of defines the Israelites' relationship with God. So how does he reconcile that?
Good question. So in Twilling to do, he's wrestling with it, and that's the best I can say. He tries to fight against following the Old Testament regulations of morality, but in the second volume, he talks about, he thinks at that point, he's like, so yesterday also, in one of the sessions, we talked about how his approach to law is something that's varying constantly over his life, and he's never fully satisfied with it. So keep that in mind. So what he does in Twilling to do is one of these stages in his approach to law. But at that point, he thinks you have to somehow, you can't abandon anything from the Old Testament commands. You have to find a way to translate these, and he proposes a pretty involved process into the whole of Christian life. It's instructive that he doesn't think that means, so we need to have a system of sacrifices set up. You see what I mean? It might come out in something that looks barely discernibly different from our current lives, but he still thinks all of that is somehow there informing the whole thing. One way to hear that is, so for example, in Romans 12:2, when Paul says, in one of Ellul's favorite passages, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed according to the renewal of your minds, offer your bodies, offer your lives to God as this living sacrifice, which is your reasonable service. Like the whole language is Old Testament priestly language. And so now your lived life is the sacrificial gift from the altar. You see what I mean? There's this transposition of the old terms into a new one. And so he wants that whole old term to be fully transposed. That's, I guess, what he's saying. Hope that helps.
Yeah.
Hi, since we're talking about jazz, something for both of you to maybe comment on. So just recently I had an interview with an actual jazz musician. So I'm just not talking out of my butt or anything. One form of jazz expression is the solo concert. So when we talk about jazz as communication amongst people, yes, but sometimes no. Sometimes, as a matter of fact, a person has to come in with a band inside of him or herself that you're actually playing with. And part of the genius of that is that the audience begins to appreciate the person who has that type of mind. But this person told me that in most cases, what sounds improvised actually is based on a structure. Now that structure could be a line of notes that are written out to create some sort of melodic or chromatic sense. Or as one other jazz musician told me, that he came into the studio and had a few notes written and then gave that to the other players and said, this is the basis on which we're going to play now. So there is a rule or law involved in there, if I'm not being too strict with those terms. But the genius is to say, here is what is stated, what can you do with it?
Yeah.
And so the freedom is involved with taking something that is just established, no matter how quick or so, and then using the spirit or genius in order to move forward and to create something new from that which was first started. I'm wondering here whether or not part of the genius or the spirit of the ethics of freedom, for both the educator, by the way, I was in college education for 11 years, so teaching gen ed, by the way, and man, I'll tell you. Okay, I got stories. But part of the genius or spirit of the educator or of the Christian working in institutions and structures and everything else is the work of the Spirit in taking something which has been kind of established and then recognizing what else can be done with it that is new based on what we know and what we were given. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Quite simply, I think, in Ellul's terms, morality is the structure, and then ethics is the jazz.
There we go. In a classroom situation, the challenge, all these things are imposed. Everything you said, Peter, dynamite, gospel. But
I think we're about out of time. This conversation is wonderful. I love it. I love what's going on here. And so many questions and comments and stuff. But because of time, we want to take a little break, and then maybe we can come back and talk about some of those, or you can talk individually with the presenters here. So let's give the presenters another hand.